If you Google the term legacy, you're bound to find website after website after website that encourages you to do estate planning, that encourages you to establish a will or a living trust or pay close attention to your financial assets. And it seems like as we get older, we realize the importance of leaving a legacy. But a legacy is more than just money. It's more than just finances. A legacy involves our character, it involves wisdom, it involves trust in God. The Israelites, they find themselves having watched their own parents and maybe grandparents wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And they're probably asking the question, how do we leave a better legacy? And maybe it's a question that we need to be asking as well. How do we leave a legacy for our kids and grandkids? How do we leave a legacy in our workplaces? How do we leave a legacy in our schools? How do we leave a godly legacy? The previous generation, they had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and they didn't really leave a legacy. The only legacy they left was a legacy of unfaithfulness. And so the next generation stands on the edge of the Jordan River, looking into the promised land, wanting to leave a better legacy. In this session, we'll be taking a look at Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. And as we do, we'll see 3 strategies that we can use to leave a godly legacy. What's the first strategy that we can use to leave a godly legacy? Well, in order to leave a godly legacy, God has to lead the way. He leads, we follow. We let God lead. The Israelites, they spent a couple days kind of sitting on the banks of the Jordan River, camping on the banks of the Jordan River. And then Joshua goes to the leaders and he has them gather up the people and he addresses them in chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Here's what Joshua says. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua tells the Israelites to let God lead. Let God lead the way in the form of the Ark of the Covenant. The priest will carry the Ark of the Covenant and it will lead about a 2,000 cubit difference between the priest and the people. That's a little over a half mile. And there's a very practical reason why they would leave this kind of separation, this distance. The priest can lead the way with the Ark of the Covenant, God leading the way through that, and everybody else can stand at a distance and they can watch the route down to the Jordan River. It can help them get through all the thickets and the dense shrubbery. They let God lead. And the Ark of the Covenant had both military and religious associations. The Ark of the Covenant was often taken into battle. It was a way of saying God was leading the charge. So the crossing of the Jordan River is seen as a military battle, a military campaign where God is leading the way. But the Ark also had religious connotations and associations. It was part of the tabernacle and later the temple. It was to represent the very presence of God, God being with his people. And so we see the Jordan River crossing as also a religious ceremony where God is leading the way, the focal point of all attention. If we want to leave a godly legacy, we let God lead. God leads, we follow. But we don't just sit back and kind of wash our hands and do nothing. Yes, God leads, but we have some responsibility as well. God leads, but the second strategy we see puts some responsibility on us. God leads, but we we've got to be willing to get our feet wet. We've got to be willing to step out in faith. We've got to be willing to take a step of trust. Joshua continues giving instructions in verses 11 through 13. He says, starting in verse 11, "See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap." There are a few details we want to highlight from those few verses. First, they're told to choose 12 men. That's one representative from each of the 12 tribes. We're not told why they're chosen at this point. That'll get revealed later on in the story. We'll find out that they're each going to carry a large stone to their place of lodging later that night. But at this point, we're just told they need to choose a representative. Second detail that we want to highlight is the priests themselves. They will carry the Ark of the Covenant into the middle of the Jordan River. Third detail, as they do that, God himself will hold up the waters upstream somewhere, keep it from going downstream. But the priests, they're going to have to be willing to get their feet wet. They're going to have to be willing to step into the water. I mean, imagine being the priests in that situation. They're standing there, and you've got all the people behind you, a half mile behind you, and you're there on the edge of the Jordan River, the promised land on the other side. But standing in between you is a fast-flowing, raging river. In the next couple verses, we're told that the river itself is at flood stage. It's in the harvest season at flood stage. Now, at non-flood stage, the Jordan River is only 4 or 5 feet deep and maybe 100 feet wide. But at flood stage, it's more than 10 feet deep, a mile wide, and it could be flowing more than 10 miles an hour with floating debris and tangled brush. And so the priests are standing there holding the Ark of the Covenant. But before God will stop the waters, they got to get their feet wet. They've got to step into the banks of the river. I mean, it would have been nice if God would have said, "I'll go ahead and slow down the water for you." But God didn't do that. Now, God wouldn't act until they took a step of faith, until they got their feet wet. And so the priests at the front step one foot in and then another, and they get their feet wet. We see them demonstrating this step of faith in verse 17, the end of the chapter. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. The priests, they've got to get their feet wet, ironically, in order for them to cross on dry ground. And when they step in, when they get their feet wet, God holds up the water some 20 miles upstream somewhere, keeping it from flowing downstream. And the priests move to the center of the Jordan River, and all the people cross over the Jordan on dry ground. And the whole time the priests are standing there. If you and I are going to leave a godly legacy, we've got to adopt these first two strategies. We've got to be willing to let God lead, and we've got to be willing to get our feet wet. We've got to let God lead in our families, our marriages, and in our parenting. We've got to let God lead in our workplaces. We've got to let God lead in our schools. We've got to let God lead in our churches. And then we've got to take responsibility and we've got to act. We've got to be willing to get our feet wet, to take steps of faith. As we get to chapter 4, we see the third strategy for leaving a godly legacy. Here's the third strategy. we have to be willing to start stacking stones. Create these memorials that remind us of God's faithfulness. That's what Joshua tells those 12 representatives to do at the beginning of chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Joshua says, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." We're finally told why those 12 representatives were to be chosen. They were going to go into the riverbed, find a smooth stone, put it on their shoulder, and carry it to their place of lodging that night. Why? Well, Joshua tells us a few verses later, in the middle of verse 6. "In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." Joshua says that there might be a day when you are parents or grandparents and you're taking a little trip, a vacation with your kids or your grandkids, and you come to this spot and they see these stones and they ask, "Grandpa, can you tell us about these stones?" And you get a chance to tell them of God's faithfulness. You get a chance to tell them how you watched him hold up the waters of the Jordan River 20 miles upstream so that we could march across on dry ground and enter into the land that he had promised hundreds of years earlier. You get to tell them of God's faithfulness. And so they all cross. These 12 representatives, they grab stones, and it seems that they exit the river. But then we get to verse 9, and there's a bit of confusion. Depending on what translation you're reading, it may look like a flashback. The NIV makes it look like a flashback, like Joshua earlier, after the people had crossed the river. He went back into the river and he looked for some stones and he found 12 stones, piled them up at the feet of the priests, and then those 12 representatives grabbed those stones and then carried them out. Other translations make it seem as if Joshua created a second altar, a second memorial right there at the feet of the priests. Translations differ and scholars disagree, but that latter reading seems to be a more natural reading to me. It seems as if Joshua, after everybody else has left, he looks down in the middle of the river and he sees this smooth stone. He picks it up, he carries it over to the priests and he sets it down at their feet. Then he looks over and he sees another one. He picks it up and sets it down, and he does this 10 more times to create a little altar of 12 more stones. And by doing that, he's acting a lot like Moses. Because after Moses led the people across the Red Sea on dry ground, he went up on a mountain, received the 10 commandments, came back down, delivered those commandments. The people said, "Yeah, we'll do all that's been commanded." And so Moses gets up, grabs 12 stones, and creates an altar as a reminder of God's faithfulness. And now his successor, Joshua, does the same thing. He finds 12 stones, builds an altar that serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness. Now that everybody is crossed the Jordan into the promised land, the priests themselves can pick up the ark and they too exit the river. And it seems like the moment that they exit the river bed, when they're on the banks of the river inside the land, God releases the river. It starts flowing, raging again, and they can probably hear the torrents behind them. And now they're in the land that God had promised hundreds of years earlier. The 12 representatives, each have a stone on one of their shoulders, and they're going to carry it to their place of lodging. We read about that in verse 19 and 20. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal, on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. Now, Gilgal just means circle. So it seems likely that at this place, they created a circular altar. Instead of stacking them up, they just created a circular altar. And it takes place on the 10th day of the first month. The 10th day of the first month was also when the Passover lamb was to be selected. You might want to hang on to that one because in our next session, when we discuss chapter 5, we will see the people of Israel celebrating their first Passover in the land. So this is pointing ahead to the next chapter. But it's also pointing backward to the book of Exodus, when they celebrated their first Passover, when God sent his angel to pass over the homes of the Israelites. And the Israelite families, they ate a meal in haste quickly as Pharaoh finally let them go. And God delivered them. And then every year they were to commemorate, they were to remember God's faithfulness. They were to remember God's deliverance by eating this Passover meal. But now, in Joshua's day, they've got something more to commemorate, something to add to their celebration. They can remember when God kept his promise and brought them into the land that he had promised for them years ago. And one final time, Joshua reminds them why they will set up this altar. Verses 21 through 24. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." Joshua says, remember, there may come a day when you take a family vacation, when you're taking a little trip and you pass by Gilgal, and you see this circular altar, and your kids or grandkids, they point it out and they say, "Can you tell us that story, Grandma, Grandpa?" And you get a chance to tell them. You tell them how God was able to part the waters of the Red Sea so that our people crossed over on dry ground. You tell them how when they looked back, the waters swallowed up the chariots of Pharaoh. And you tell them how we got to witness God hold up a raging river at flood stage so that we too could cross on dry ground and enter into the land that he had promised. You tell them the story of God's faithfulness. So start stacking stones. Why? 2 reasons. So that all the world will know that our God is mighty, that he's powerful, that he's able. And second, so that we will be in awe of him forever. So start stacking stones. Start stacking stones that remind us that our God is mighty, that he's able. He's able to part the Red Sea. He's able to defeat Pharaoh's army. He's able to halt a river at flood stage. He's able to rescue and deliver us from evil. He's able to deliver us from the darkness within. He's able to save us from sin. He's able to rescue and deliver and heal and save. He's able to break chains of addiction. He's able to restore broken and fractured marriages and relationships. He's able. So start stacking stones. Start stacking stones that remind us of God's faithfulness, that remind us of his goodness and his mercy and his grace, that remind us of his mighty hand and his relentless love. If you want to leave a legacy that you can pass on to the next generation, let God lead, get your feet wet, and start stacking stones.